what we just discovered is that we need to have externalists rally against Zuckerberg and say, look, you're making things very modally unsafe for us. You need to stop. You know, this is not good. So just real quick, last follow up here. Do you think that you have different evidence than the brain in a vat or the simulated sim because of like content externalism, that you've interacted with real things and they've interacted with digital or simulated things? Is that what makes the evidence different? Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life with experts in those fields. I really love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. In this episode, I have with me another special guest, Dr. Matthew Benton, and we're going to be talking about a new book that he's co-edited, called Religious Disagreement and Pluralism, and it covers the disagreement literature. I never know what to call it. The epistemology of disagreement and how it applies to religious disagreements and religious pluralism. It's a really fantastic book with a lot of great contributors. And I can say that because a lot of them have been on my podcast already, which is awesome. But I really like this book. I wish I had it with me. OUP sent me a digital copy. They were gracious enough to do that, but I don't have a picture for you. But I think Matt has one. He has a hard copy he can show you. Before we jump in and get into religious disagreement, how it applies to our own religious faith, I want to thank everyone over on Patreon for making this podcast happen. More and more of you have been joining the Patreon team. I really, really appreciate you guys. If you have found value from this podcast, if it's your top 5, top 10 favorite podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. I would love to be traveling. I would love to do this as a full-time gig and be with Matthew Benton in person talking about religious disagreement. So thank you everyone who has become a patron. Another way to support the podcast, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave me a 5-star review and leave me a comment. It helps trick the algorithms into feeding this out to a lot more people. That would be awesome. All right. So without further ado, let's bring in Dr. Matthew Benton and let's get into religious disagreement. Matt, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Thanks, Parker. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah. I don't know if I mentioned, but you're the associate professor of philosophy at Seattle Pacific University. How'd you get into philosophy in the first place? How'd you want to become a philosopher?
Good. Yeah. I was one of those people who took a kind of different route into philosophy. I didn't major in philosophy as an undergrad, and I did history and English. And toward the end of it, I was getting really interested in like the history of theology and taking classes in like English classes as like biblical literature and stuff. So I was kind of like helping myself to a lot of sort of nearby issues. But I really got into it mainly by doing degrees in theology. So I know a lot of your, listeners are, you say, often master's degree students in like, say, philosophy or theology, or sometimes faculty places, sometimes perhaps just interested people, sometimes maybe pastors, apologists, that kind of thing. And I got into all that kind of stuff at the same time, but I went to seminary twice. I went to Fuller, and then I went to Yale Divinity School, kind of like interested in these ideas, becoming more interested in the academic side, wanting to teach someday. And so then really didn't get into philosophy proper until the end, until I did a PhD in it. And so it's kind of like vaguely theological stuff, straight up theology, then like philosophy of religion, then straight up philosophy.
That's awesome.
Long-winded kind of way to get to it. I wouldn't recommend that route for most people.
Oh, that's good. I'm actually on that route myself right now.
Yeah. I mean, if it works out fine, great. But like, it's I often felt like I had missed out and had to regret lost ground when I hadn't majored in philosophy, and then realized I was starting to do it much more, and then even do it professionally. So
yeah.
But the background that I have is really helpful for the kinds of things I often teach and work in as well. So
yeah, it's right. Like now you're at the intersection of all this stuff, which is really cool. And I found this podcast is really cool. I like blessing people with it and stuff, but it's really first and foremost, it was kind of a selfish thing for me to learn more about philosophy and theology. But I can read your guys' stuff and have you on and have a conversation with you. So if anyone else learns from it, that's pretty cool too. What'd you end up doing your PhD dissertation on?
So I did epistemology. I had kind of always been interested in that, especially religious epistemology. Like, what is it that I'm a Christian? I'm from a Christian background and still a Christian, and you get a lot of talk of religious belief and what that amounts to, and then there's this whole area, philosophy, a kind of core, central area about like knowledge and belief and evidence and all of this. And so I went to Rutgers. I did a PhD with a dissertation on knowledge norms. The rough ideas had to do with whether knowledge itself provides a kind of fundamental norm on various things, like on assertion is one of the big ones I continue to sort of write a lot on. That, like, when you assert, outright assert that something is so, you ought to know that the thing is so. You're in some sense falling short if you don't know what you assert. And then there's other ideas, whether you should only act on propositions that you know. So there's whether it's a norm of action, and then also finally in the dissertation anyway, some ideas about whether knowledge provides a norm on belief itself, which so this is a lot of this is drawing on Timothy Williamson's knowledge first epistemology, where it's kind of reversing the order of what you're theorizing about and in terms of what you're doing it. So normally, if you're thinking in epistemology, you're thinking, especially if you get at it through the Gettier kind of literature, you're like, what makes a belief knowledge is the kind of guiding idea. And then you get to talk about, justification and truth and then what else might be needed. And that's a pretty standard way to think about it. I mean, even in everyday non-philosophers will talk about it that way.
Right.
But this approach or the set of ideas I was reading on and talking about, want to think of putting knowledge to work, some of that normative work. So instead of thinking, oh, you have to have a justified belief or something like that in order to assert the thing you believe, or in order to act upon it, the idea is like knowledge is actually the fundamental norm.
Yeah.
We'll even talk about what belief is in terms of knowledge. So this was this, along with actually at the time a lot of epistemology of disagreement. This was becoming a very big area in the literature when I was a PhD student, and I didn't write actually that much on disagreement at the time, but I did more on this other stuff. And I mean, you can, if readers are interested, I later wrote up the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a kind of online resource, much like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where you can just go, it's open access. There's an entry on knowledge norms, reviewing all this literature that I wrote.
Oh, awesome. That's
even structured largely in terms of the order of the chapters in which I approach things.
Okay.
So if you're like, what is that stuff he's talking about? And we probably won't talk much about it too much the rest of this interview. You can go find that. I can even send you a link if you want it.
Yeah, that'd be huge. Yeah, that'd be awesome to get more of your stuff out there. People could see what you're working on. Do you mentioned Williamson? Do you consider yourself a knowledge firster yourself?
Pretty much most days of the week, anyway. Not every single bit of it, but a lot of it. So I'm definitely in the camp that thinks knowledge is the norm of assertion.
Okay.
In fact, it's part of how you can even demarcate or individuate the speech act of assertion, that it has its norm on it. And I'm also, at the time of the dissertation, I was actually not as keen on the idea that knowledge is a norm of action or that knowledge is the norm of belief in the sense of being a norm of permission.
Yeah.
That you ought to believe only what you know. It sounds kind of awkward and backwards. But I've actually warmed to that view even a little bit, because I think it provides a kind of an interesting theoretical structure that lets you say a bunch of things that weren't even conceivable before you start making this reversal. And I'm on record in some other work thinking about the nature of defeat or epistemic defeaters and like whether knowledge defeat is plausible, arguing from more of a knowledge first perspective on, like, if knowledge is the norm of belief, we could actually have a way of diagnosing why we'd have these intuitions or judgments about cases where it looks like there are defeaters. But then you can say some other things about, well, in lots of cases, actually, your knowledge makes it the case that you don't have a defeater. And it's harder to say that if you take the more traditional route. So I like a lot of it. I tend to like a lot of Williamson's other ideas. Like if I'm pushed on what the nature of evidence is, I actually like the E equals K view. A lot of not very popular views. I mean, some people will say there's a kind of like, popularity to it because a lot of people are talking about it and are on board with it, but most philosophers aren't keen on it. So I think I must be sort of convinced that there's a lot to this that's worthwhile if I'm going to actually go this sort of rogue route. But that's where I've sort of landed, at least in some of the writing I've done.
Okay, well, that's awesome. Man, there's so much stuff there that I would love to chase, but we got to get into this paper here.
Yeah, that's fine.
you said that you said that you didn't come to disagreement stuff till later. How'd you get into disagreement? Why? I mean, so you co-edited this book that OUP sent me, which is awesome, with Jonathan. Yeah, there it is. I don't know how to say it. Can you say it again? Quanvig. That's good. I said it like an idiot before. Quanvig.
That's okay. Say it like a W. Yeah.
Yeah, Quanvig. Okay, that's great. Sounds much better. So I mean, you edited a whole book on it now. So how'd you get into it? Like what? Yeah.
So I mean, about 10, 15 years ago, when I was a PhD student, it was like this was the main papers that became really huge on this literature, at least in that period, and a lot of people in epistemology were talking about them, had just sort of come out. So it was like 06, 07, 05, 06, 07, 08, somewhere in there. You get Feldman had a couple of papers on it, but they came a little later than even Roger White's important paper on epistemic permissivism.
Okay.
And I remember having a couple of seminars, epistemology seminars with Sosa and Ernie Sosa and Alvin Goldman, in which we're reading like these kind of big papers. Everyone's weighing in on it. Tom Kelly and Adam Elga and like all these kind of big younger names. And I must have written a paper somewhere on it related to it, but I didn't too much pursue it in the dissertation or later work. But in a way, it, especially because so much of the literature is guided initially or was kind of said first by people who had their eyes on religious disagreement. I had already read little things a bit about it, and I think what brought me back to it in part was, well, look, if you do a lot of epistemology, and not just, I kind of have done a lot on lots of different areas and then verged into this too. If you do a lot of epistemology lately, then you run up against this kind of idea. And if you do a lot of religious epistemology, thinking about, religious belief, the possibility of religious knowledge, what kinds of knowledge that might be, what the nature of faith is, all of this, these gonna kind of come together for you. You're gonna have to think about them a little bit because most people, at least especially in a kind of more recent, I think in the Western context especially, but they're in more globalized context, everyone's aware that there are lots of people who don't share their views and maybe share some of their views but have different views. And we all kind of, it's very uncommon these days for someone to be raised in a scenario where they don't like realize, where it's so kind of cocooned that like they think everyone thinks the same way as them.
All you need is one social media app and you'll see.
I mean,
even if you're a Calvinist, you're not the right kind of Calvinist. So let's get that straight. And
so
here we go.
I mean, even especially with the advent of social media, it turns out that disagreeing with other people is almost like a way of relating to them and like
that's right.
Being mean to people is part of what you're apparently doing. But the more kind of intellectual theoretical question, I mean, that's a practical ethical question about how to treat people who you disagree. Another one though is like what do you do with the fact that there are these people who disagree? And in philosophy, of course, more generally, Sandy Goldberg and others have written on this, like it's a context in which there's all kinds of arguments in different directions. And almost everyone is very, very smart, well apprised of other people's arguments and ideas. And so then like how could you kind of defend a view of any kind while thinking that like you're on the right track because like what about all these other people who think differently or can argue against it, So I mean, I think I finally came back to it partly because the other editor who initiated work on this volume, it wasn't Quanvig, it was another guy. It was Fritz Warfield, who with Rich Feldman co-edited that first big volume on disagreement around that period. It didn't come out until like 2009 or 2010. But Fritz was the one who approached me and said, we should do a volume on this, on religious disagreement. I was like, yeah, it's a good idea. And then for other reasons, he had to back away and not continue it, and John took over. But it made sense to me because I had already done a lot of philosophy, epistemology of religion kind of material. If I'm going to plug my own work, I might as well plug my...
Do it, plug it away.
I already had another book come out of I had a postdoc at Oxford in a big project on new insights in religious epistemology, and then we did a volume on that. And so I had done some of that, but I hadn't done too much on disagreement. So I thought, yeah, and I know a lot of people who are working on this. Feldman, of course, kind of got that jump started on the religious, or the recent version of this literature, discussing it. But then most of it took the direction of mainstream epistemology, thinking about this stuff. And so then you had a lot of other philosophers after that, some of which whom are religious, some of whom are agnostics or atheists, nevertheless thinking about, well, how does this get applied here in the domain of religion? You also get in nearby work. We probably won't talk about this, and I don't venture into it much in the book, in the opening chapter either, but there's a whole area of moral disagreement too, where how can you have a view about morality, whatever your view is, and have all these different, especially about meta-theoretical stuff about meta-ethics and all of that, or if you're like, here are some realists, or here are some objectivists, and then here are subjectivists, and here are relativists, and like here are realists, but they're realists not because they're Platonists, and here are realists or objectivists because they're like theists or whatever. Like there's similar matters, including just everyday people's judgments about moral cases. I mean, right now, abortion, of course, is such a big thing. It's always been a big thing, but now it's back, pressing on everyone to think carefully about it, or just know what at least the legal situation should be. Like, what do you do about the fact that there are lots of people who think differently about you on that issue, say?
Yeah. Well, that's what's so fascinating about disagreement literature. I keep getting pulled back into it, and I think when I don't think about it too much, I'm like, that's no big deal, And then I think about it a little bit more, I read some stuff, and I'm like, wow, this hits everyone. And religious disagreement's fun because whether you're agnostic or an atheist or whatever stripe of theist, it hits everyone. There's people who disagree with you that look like they're your peers, who are not so easy to write off. They look like they're smart people. You appreciate them. They don't seem like they're moral reprobates, and yet they believe completely different than you. And like, you don't have an error theory where you just say, well, they're so deluded and stupid, which is wild. I think that's fantastic. So let's jump in on like disagreement generally. I've had a few episodes on epistemology. I need help saying this. I know people say disagreement literature, but is it right to say the epistemology of disagreement or epistemological disagreement? It's not really epistemological disagreement, but how do you refer to this phenomenon?
I mean, most of it is construed as the epistemology of disagreement.
Okay.
So it's like a branch of epistemology in that, when you frame it that way.
Okay.
And they're thinking in pretty general terms about various cases in which disagreement ought to have a kind of normative pressure put on you to reconsider your belief or whatever your doxastic stance is.
Okay.
But they're usually, of course, they're starting by thinking about very clean cases.
Yeah.
And then they're thinking, that's one way to think about it. And they'll often then take those clean cases and think something similar is going to have to apply in these dirty, messy cases.
Yeah.
There's another approach, of course, that is working with principles and supposing that, like the Roger White thing about and Feldman too, that uniqueness looks like it's a principle that would have to hold, and here's a bunch of reasons why. And whatever you say about that's going to then have ramifications for what you think any normative principles would be about in any or all cases of disagreement.
Yeah. Okay. It always trips me up because I think like there's like philosophy of logic, but you can also call it philosophical logic. But if you say like epistemological disagreement, it sounds like you're only referring to disagreements in epistemology instead of the epistemology of disagreement. So this stuff always messes with me. But okay,
that's right though.
Does that sound right? Okay. So, real quick, let's go over just some terms. Let's talk about belief, credence, understanding, and faith. And I think we're going to talk probably mostly about belief, but just for it's always great to get a philosopher to define these terms for me. Like, what is belief?
That's a hard one. So I think we can, for our purposes, we can get pretty close to something that works.
Okay.
This is difficult because even in this literature, one of the reasons this literature became a big thing was because you have what you might think of traditional epistemologists working with a notion of outright belief. There's coarse notions like outright belief, outright disbelief, where you think it's false, believe it's false, and then suspension of judgment or withholding judgment as being the three kind of main categories.
Right.
But then you also have sometimes called formal epistemologists working with more fine-grained ideas, like sometimes called partial belief, sometimes called graded belief, sometimes called just credences. We can talk about that in a minute because I know we can get to that in a second, but let's just work with outright belief.
Yeah.
The kind of thing most of us have a very good grip on. Normally the idea there is like, you're making a kind of mental people who are, mature and like well cognitively developed, who can bring ideas to mind, right? They might even be able to introspect and say, well, what do I believe about this or that? And in that case, they might just be making a judgment about what they think is true, right? Yeah. But you might think, actually, we're not that good at that. And in some ways, our actions will be a better guide to whether we believe various things.
Yeah.
But here's the idea. Outright belief is a kind of full-on mental commitment to some truth.
Okay.
I think a decent way to get at that, perhaps, one of the ways a gloss I like that's sort of knowledge first oriented is like, when you believe, it's just when you take yourself to know.
Okay.
That's not going to be perfect as a definition, but it's going to capture some of the phenomenology, I think, of like what it feels like when we have beliefs.
Yeah, because you don't
outright belief like this of the full-on kind.
Yeah.
You typically regard yourself as knowing.
Yeah, you take yourself to believe it. You don't have doesn't seem like you have beliefs that you think are wrong. Right? Like you take them to be cases of knowledge, otherwise they wouldn't be your belief.
Usually. Now, I mean, we can make room for this. There are going to be a lot, especially when you start thinking about inductive cases, probabilistic cases.
Yeah.
Or cases where you're tentative enough that you might drop the belief under very nearby circumstances or something else. But when you believe outright, you usually are committed enough that it would take a lot to move you off of it.
Okay.
Another way to think about outright belief in this sense, I think, might be, maybe you don't have to go with the take yourself to know it, but like you could take, and this will be related to the credence idea too, you might gloss it in terms of your dispositions to put bets down. So
that kind of goes with the action, like you were talking about before. Like, would you act in this way? Would you act on that belief?
Yeah. Maybe let's before we even think about betting behavior, let's just think of like cases where, I mean, I'm in Seattle, it's raining a lot today. Suppose you don't like getting wet in the rain. Well, you're going to kind of make a bet, as it were, by choosing to take your raincoat or your umbrella when you go out, right? And you might care about that a lot by like checking the weather or looking outside or realizing what time of year it is and how often it is that it rains around here then. But if you believe outright that it's going to rain and you also desire not to get wet, you're normally going to act on it by doing something that kind of reveals to you that that's what you believe.
Right.
So I think that's a kind of everyday case that's useful to helping us see it.
Okay.
So if you think of grabbing the umbrella or whatever as a kind of almost a practical way of placing a bet, not money, right? But it's like you're doing that. Then that's also like we act on what we believe. Often what we believe in that sense would be something that we just treat as knowledge. It is true in our practical reasoning, or if we're going to tell someone what, in a conversation where it matters, that thing, we're normally going to outright assert it.
Yeah.
That's all sort of tracking what outright belief amounts to.
Okay.
But the betting behavior thing is the way that some philosophers, to some extent, I think, Frank Ramsey when he originally got at this, and some people after him, thinking like, look, you can define a kind of probabilistic notion too, where there's a certain amount of money you'd be willing to put down.
Yeah.
This is of course related to how much money you have and diminishing marginal, returns and stuff like that. But like leave that to the side to make it easier. Like, would you bet $10 on this? If you're going to hesitate, then maybe you don't outright believe it. But there's going to be a range of conditions under which, sure, it's probable enough for you that you put $10 down, something. But if you think it's unlikely, whatever the thing is, you're surely not going to put $10 down. And so the idea about credences, or sometimes it's just construed as subjective probability, is that we have less than full-on belief a lot of the time. And normally we're pretty good at knowing that we have at least not full-on belief.
Yeah.
We think something's somewhat likely, right? And so I think we're often, we may not put a precise number on it. Between the way that this is often construed is think of like the array of numbers between real numbers between 0 and 1, and it's like 0.5 is in the middle. Well, that's like roughly the analog of suspending judgment, where 1 would be certainty. Suppose you have P and not P at both ends. If you have probability 1 that P, then that's like being certain that P, and that presumably is going to go along with outright belief that P. Right. But if you have 0.6, you're like, you think it's a bit more likely than not that P, but you don't that confident of it, basically. Right. So these are measures of how confident you are. Yeah. Proposition. And of course, then you can apply mathematical models to think this through, and there are these constraints. And formal epistemologists will play a lot with, like, there's a kind of mathy version of this where they're thinking you get some new evidence. How do you change what your number would be on matter? But the basic idea is, like, if you're one side of 0.5, then you think it's more likely than not. If you're to the other side, if you're like 0.4, less than 0.5 towards 0, you actually think you're more confident that it's false, right? But that's a way of that's just another way of believing, right? Or having a partial belief toward the other side that the thing is false.
So when that,
go ahead, sorry.
When all that comes into play and you get the Bayesians, ripping off, just going with the theorem. I wonder how I bet there's literature on this, but I don't know it, about like the psychology of credences and how well we can determine our own credences. What do you think about that? How accurate are you at determining your own credences?
I think we're often pretty bad. I mean, that's what's interesting about this whole area of formal epistemology. It's largely, and they'll often talk in this way, it's an idealization. Okay. So the idea is that they're thinking about ideal rationality, the structure of it, what the most perfect way to update your credences in response to new information is, and so on. And then of course, usually how that's going to play out in a decision theory that's going to let that model do some work and just helping you decide what to do. So in a way, of course, it's related to the acting stuff, and maybe not betting exactly, but insofar as any actions, a kind of bet. It's based on what you believe or what you think is most probable. But I think we're not that good at a lot of it. I think sometimes we're fairly good at certain mundane things, but when things get complicated, we're very bad. Okay. Like, we let me just rephrase that. We're bad at putting precise numbers on things. Sure. We might be fairly good at having a sense of whether we land between 0.5 and do we think things are more likely than not? We might be fairly good at that judgment. Often, if you have a good grip on your background information and the way you've used sort of your inductive grounds for other things about some matter where you have a lot of experience with it. Yeah. You'd be fairly good at making a kind of this is probable, or at least somewhat probable. Yeah. rather than improbable.
Right.
But that's just a contrastive notion. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
think any of us are going to be like, oh, that's 0.9, whereas 0.6. Like, the only way that tends to be plausible, at least for most of us, is like, you watch the weather, or you look on your phone. We have fancy weather apps now where it's like, here's the percentage, here's the like thing they're giving you. Oh, it's 80% chance of rain today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you might, especially if you have a lot of experience with that app, you might be like, I'll just be 0.8 that it's going to rain today.
Yeah, right.
But that's just a kind of testimony that, not just from an individual, but we had an older version before apps. You watch the weatherman or something,
Right.
and he said, very likely to rain today.
Right. You're just, in that sense, you're like, even that though, you'd be like punting on it. You'd be like outmoding your credences to someone else, to a machine, or to whoever's running the app. I have some friends, like this dude Joe Schmidt, who I bet that dude could tell the difference between like 0.6 and 0.7, but like I can't, and I think most people probably are not. But it's helpful that it's idealized. It's a feel. I think it's probably more likely than not. Well,
Say,
so
can I just add two things about why sort of independent? That was just rolling with like how it often feels to us, how good we seem like we are at it.
Right.
But there are other considerations that should lead you to think we're kind of bad at a lot of basic judgments of probability. One is a more theoretical one from the epistemology side. I mean, I've already expressed how allied I am with Williamson, and some others too have argued, like, even when you're not always in a good position to know what you know, or know that you know it. And so there's a sense in which you might think, like, maybe typically we're well positioned with respect to our mental states, or with respect to some other things that are mental for us, where, like, let's suppose credences are like that. But the idea that we're like very good at figuring out what they are is like needs some motivation.
Okay.
Also, with respect to probability itself, we have, I don't know how much you've read outside of these areas of philosophy, but the work by like Kahneman and Tversky on like, how bad people are at making probabilistic judgments. There's this famous, so Daniel Kahneman and I think it's Alfred, or get his first name, Tversky. Tversky died a while back, but Kahneman for their joint work, won the Nobel Prize. He was an economist, but also worked in psychology, kind of both. And they had these famous papers where they're doing like one of the initial cases, one of the initial examples is like they just ask people questions about things in these psychology experiments. And they're like, look, here's an individual. This isn't quite the exact case, but it's close. Here's someone, and tell us how likely it is you think that they are ending up doing this job.
Yeah.
Like, here's the woman, Jan. She's a Berkeley graduate. She is a bookworm. She supports women's rights on various things. They would read you all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then they'd say, how likely is it that she's a this and that, something else, right? So you're kind of just making these social judgments, these associations.
Right.
And one of the questions is about how do you think she's a librarian? And then another question is, do you think she's a feminist? But then a third one would be like, how likely do you think she's a librarian and a feminist? Where they give you that, and you're going to track the feminist thing and attach it given the things you said. Whereas the librarian part kind of fits with what you think.
Yeah.
But part of the result of these like cases is people will over attribute probability in cases where it's two things, where the two together are supposed to be less likely than just the one.
Right.
And so if you ask her how likely is it she's a librarian, you get far lower like judgments that yes, that sounds right. But if you ask her a feminist librarian or whatever, goes up. But like, that's weird. You should not. There's lots of cases like this. You can do base rate fallacy things like, how likely is it that she's a teacher? How likely is it that she's a librarian? Well, in any given city, far more teachers than librarians, right?
Yeah.
But like the librarian fits the kind of social categorization of things that they mentioned in the description, things like a bookworm or whatever.
Yeah.
And so that's also something you can. And so like the part of the point is like we make these kind of the book that later Kahneman gives is about thinking fast and slow. It's like we make fast judgments of using heuristics without doing the slower thing, which would be like think through what the likelihoods are. And so I think only when you've been tutored in a bunch of that and see how easily we can mess it up, would you be a little more careful to make probabilistic judgments in the right way.
Yeah.
That's all to point out we maybe aren't that good at what we actually think our credences would be on its own matter.
Yeah. So Matt, you're dude, you're a wealth of information on epistemology, and I really hope that you answer this in the way I'm expecting. But do you think that this has helped you think fast and slow? Like studying these kind of cases, do you think that you would do better on those kind of tests where you're looking at whether she's a librarian or not? Do you think that it would actually help? I hope that you say yes. Please say yes.
I mean, it probably depends on how much seriousness I'm giving it.
Okay.
Like kind of notoriously, these psychology experiments, they're given largely to 20-year-old undergraduates.
Yeah, that's right.
Care about what's going on. They're just they're doing it because they're in a class that's maybe a psychology class that
they got free pizza for it or something.
For it, yeah, right. Yeah. And so I don't know. I mean, I think we're going to be better at putting the right kind of effort in when we think something matters.
Yeah.
I think that I haven't learned probably quite enough to be able to do it carefully all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'd be a little better, or I'd be at least a little more alert to the mistakes I might make.
Yeah.
On certain matters, but I don't know that's going to make me all that much better of a judger with respect to certain questions.
Yeah.
Only people who have been, very well.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Ability theory will be able to kind of go into that mode. But I do think you can learn it. I think you can. I mean, just like I teach a lot of logic, like I'm much better at evaluating arguments because I had to learn all that and had to teach it to other people. And so there's a kind of skill, right, involved in some of this. It's not just about learning that these things are out there. It takes a lot of practice. Almost anything would.
That's awesome. That's a good point. I just wanted to rebut any kind of notions that it goes around where people are like, oh, ethics teachers aren't ethical and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, some aren't. Some are really, really influenced by ethical arguments to become vegans or they think it's okay to eat meat now or whatever. But like philosophy is important and it does change your life and it changes the way you think and reason. So I like what you made this great distinction though. Just because you study it doesn't mean you're going to be like this master test taker because you're not out there practicing test taking. Like same thing with like a philosopher isn't necessarily going to be amazing at the GRE if they didn't study the GRE for 3 months before taking it.
Yeah, you should make the same claim about, the distinction between coaches or teachers and practitioners, like athletes.
Yeah.
Somebody who's an athlete would be amazing at what they do, later they get older, they become a coach. Well, by becoming a coach, they still have a version of the skill, but it's not going to be able to hit home runs and stuff. It's more like they can, but it's a different skill to teach other people how to do it well.
Yeah.
It is to do it yourself, right?
Right. You're hitting home a little bit too much for me here because I used to be a
Sorry.
wrestler. I used to be a wrestler and I'm trying to get it back. Yeah. All right. Well, let's go in on some more disagreement here. For those who are uninitiated, I mean, a lot of you guys are initiated if you're listening to this, but if you made it this far and you want like a deep dive, there's a bunch of other episodes. I've done at least 3 others on epistemological disagreement. But Matt, can you just give us a quick overview? What's the core of disagreement literature?
So the epistemology of disagreement tends to focus on questions about whether there are broad obligations that we have to revise your belief or downgrade your confidence in some belief you have when you discover that a certain kind of person in a certain kind of scenario disagrees with you on it. Now, you might think the easiest such a case of disagreeing is like suppose here's a certain scenario that really matters. We tend to have largely the same evidence, because of course, if we have different evidence, it's not very interesting that we might disagree. Like, and that we're often going to think of ourselves as peers on that matter. Like, where, I mean, there's lots of different ways that philosophers working on this try to think about a peer, but the basic idea involves at least, you think they're about as smart as you and well apprised of some of the information. Maybe that's going to build in what you have similar background, knowledge or information, so that you know what to do with this evidence you both have or share. So that same kind of evidence and similar in peerhood, or being a peer. If there's a case like that, and then you find that you disagree in this way. Suppose I believe that P is true, and then you're my peer, and we are sharing the same. We look at the same evidence, but you come to conclude that not P. That's a very clear case of disagreeing. Like, you believe something's false that I ended up believing is true.
Yeah.
You might ask other nearby questions. What if you ended up suspending judgment on the basis of that evidence, whereas I ended up believing? That's not quite the kind of disagreement we normally have in mind, but it is a kind of disagreement. Like, that your ending judgment was to conclude not to believe either any particular thing. Yeah. To wait, as it were. You're like, the evidence isn't compelling me either direction.
Yeah.
Believe or disbelieve. Whereas I'm like, oh, I believe, right? So I mean, they think of cases like this, and especially like once we've learned about each other, both that we have that same kind of evidence, and we at least think of each other as peers. It sure feels like that provides a pressure for both of us to revise or rethink, or at least suspend judgment on our belief while we look into it more.
Right.
Like the very finding out that someone like that, with that kind of evidence, doesn't believe the same way I do is not often the way it's construed is like it's itself a kind of evidence of some kind that I have to respond to on pain of irrationality.
Yeah, higher order.
Typically, the way it's running. I mean, that's one way to think about it.
Okay.
The higher order evidence thing, but I notice that this seems like this can happen in all kinds of cases. Like, I don't know, in your other episodes, if you talked about Christensen's dinner check splitting case, that's a very standard one to start with.
Yeah.
Or even perceptual cases of like, Tom Kelly's got a case where it's like, you view a horse race and you're both kind of standing right at the finish line, and these two horses' heads go across real fast, and I think one horse won and you think another one. That's not, it's like we had what looks like the same angle of perception at the matter, like roughly the same, we were supposing we have the same evidence in that case. The structure of these is like trading on important things where it looks like there's almost should be a kind of canceling out. Like, I see that you dealt with the evidence differently than I did. And I think you should be as good as I am at evaluating that evidence. It'd be a bit weird or irrational for me to be like, I got it right, and so you need to rethink your view.
Yeah. Like, without some kind of like error theory, right? Like if you saw that, like, oh, maybe I'm a step further than him, closer to the line where I can see directly on and he can't. Like, if you had one of those, it's fair game for you to hold to your. It might be fair game. I know everything in epistemology.
Yeah, I mean that's I think the idea that would disrupt the idea that we're peers or that we have some evidence.
Yeah. Well, so
inside those kinds of cases, yeah.
With the peer stuff is so fun to think through. I wonder if I think that you're my peer, and we disagree. I think you're my peer. You don't think that we're peers. Should I take you to be my peer? Like, we're disagreeing on that. I guess it would depend if I hold to like some form of conciliationism. Let's say I do, and what's the 50-50 one where it's like suspend judgment? What's that one called? That type of conciliationism?
Well, do you mean that you ought to both move to suspend judgment?
Yeah.
That's often the result of an equal weight view.
Equal weight, yeah. Right.
There's a certain view of conciliation. So conciliationism, right, is the view that like, well, roughly that these kinds of cases mean you ought to conciliate. That now how to do that is one question. How far you have to do it.
Okay.
Equal weight view just says in cases where same evidence, same or similar abilities, like being a peer, you ought to treat your peer's judgment with equal weight to your own.
Yeah.
And normally in a clean case, what that would mean is, if you believe that P and I believe that not P, well, we should probably revert back to suspending judgment, or if it's a probabilistic case, I'm like 0.8 and you're like 0.2, we should both go to 0.5.
Yeah, it's like if there's a scale and I'm treating my weight as heavier, but then I treat yours equally, they're back to neutral.
Sure. I mean, nice. This model in epistemology is nicely used. This kind of scales.
Yeah.
Because it's representing for us in physical terms how it is that you put something on one side, the other one has to move.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Well, so we're at the horse race, and we both, I think that Seabiscuit won, and you think, Mud Clomper won. And I think, well, you're my peer, so I should probably conciliate here. And you're like, no, we're not peers. So now I have this
now we have two disagreements, right?
Yeah, right. And we have a disagreement over whether we're peers or not. And so it's like, should I think that should I withhold judgment on whether you're my peer? And then that would have like this effect on me believing that Seabiscuit won. See what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, good. I mean, I haven't thought about this kind of case very often. Here's one thing you might think about how that should go. I'm just going to put some different ideas out there for how one could argue. In a case where we conclude differently, and you're like willing to conciliate. So again, we have roughly the same evidence. Let's say you think of us as peers, and then I'm like, no, you're not my peer. One thing you might do is say, oh, geez, like I definitely need to defer to him now, because if he thinks I'm not his peer because he presumably thinks that he's superior on this matter, maybe I have a further reason now to move you away from my view or away from my belief I started with. But you might actually run the other way. You might, again, it's going to depend maybe on your personality, but also you have some background information. It's like, wait, I could only be his peer if he's humble enough to think I'm his peer. Or sorry, he could only be my peer if he's humble enough to think that I'm his peer.
Yeah.
His telling me that I'm not his peer is a reason for me to think there's something amiss, some kind of epistemic vice in him.
Yeah.
So maybe that throws it off. So you're not really sure what to do with it. But doesn't necessarily mean you have more pressure to conciliate.
Okay.
I don't know that would give you too much reason to stick with your guns on it, but I don't know. That's just to point out that finding out that someone else doesn't view you as a peer isn't itself going to push you in a particular direction yet.
Okay.
Because you might have reason to think they're wrong about that.
Yeah.
And now you have like a reason to think they're wrong about the higher order thing of whether we're peers, but then also you started off with thinking their judgment was wrong because you concluded differently.
Right.
So it kind of, in some ways, this is a very complicated scenario.
Yeah.
I don't think it's clear exactly what a conciliationist would have to say about that case.
Okay. That's good. I like
that case. It's really interesting.
Well, I started the whole case because I wanted to work in if someone is or isn't appeared to purely, but it was too cheeky inside, and I didn't want to try
too purely.
I thought that was too much. Yeah. So, okay. So I was wondering for yourself, like, do you consider yourself a conciliationist at all?
I think it depends on what the view is trying to say. I mean, I think usually the view, to be an interesting view, will insist that in a range of these cases, you must conciliate somehow. Mm-hmm. If all that means is only in the cases where it looks like we're peers and we seem to have pretty much all the same evidence, I think even there, I'm not quite sure conciliationism is right, because we need a story about, like, it's not clearly a purely conciliationist story about what other stuff gets to matter.
Okay.
Like, do we count as peers if we have different background beliefs or different, even on a, credence framework, we have different prior probabilities. Like, if you have different prior probability function, and here's some evidence comes into both of us, I'm going to land probably on a different output number than you.
Right.
But it's going to be rational for me to do that given my priors, and it's going to be rational for you to do that given our priors. So are we thinking that being a peer means having all and only the same background evidence or
Mm.
background priors, that's going to be hard to ever find another peer, right?
Yeah.
And so kind of depends on how you work out the details of this. There's also the matter of like, do we really share evidence? Like, what is evidence such that we could share it? These easy cases sure feel like they give easy answers in favor of a conciliationist, or at least the conciliationist explains the pressure to rethink it in a nice way. But once we look at like how often this is going to come up, part of me wants to say this hardly ever happens in these pure cases.
Yeah.
And so then it's like it might be that it's narrowed it so much to just these really easy cases where if the conciliationist view says in the easy cases you ought to conciliate, then I'll be like, yeah, sure. It's just kind of an uninteresting view if it like doesn't come up very much.
Yeah, if it only hits those really easy ones. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm more interested in do I have obligations in cases where it kind of looks like we're peers and we have largely the same evidence? And then furthermore, I hear from you how in complicated cases, how you process the evidence, and then I disclose to you how I process the evidence. Now we're going to start making different judgments about, I might not think you're not my peer anymore, but I might think, look, I can see a mistake in your reasoning right there.
Yeah.
Conciliation doesn't tell me I mean, once you throw off the similarness, it's like conciliationism isn't built to talk about those cases. So,
right.
So in a way, it starts to look like, yeah, there are going to be cases where I should conciliate, the very clean ones. Mm-hmm. But if you think that conciliation is the view that like having defined up these notions of what similar evidence is and what peerhood and consistent, that it happens a lot, and furthermore, we're obligated in those cases to always conciliate, I find it to be hard to make the case that that's really going to apply across the board in those kinds of cases.
Yeah.
So I kind of like the idea in general, but the working out of it in particular, especially messy cases, it's tough. And so that's not to say that I love steadfast views either, but it's more like the steadfaster who thinks there are certain even clean looking cases where you are within your rights to stick to what you ended up believing, even without, say, an error theory or some explanation of how things might have gone awry for them and not for you. Well, I think it's really hard. I'm more of like thinking like case by case. You give me a case I can think about. Yeah. Sometimes looks like steadfast is actually fine. Like you're not going to be violating any kind of interesting norm by remaining steadfast in some of those cases.
Yeah, it seems like it always comes back to Chisholm's problem of the criterion, where it's like just being a particularist in general about lots of stuff. Like maybe the Methodists are always going to run into problems, and so if you're like I'm a steadfast or hardcore through and through, or I'm a conciliationist, like, well, here's a case, and just talk to a philosopher, and they'll find a case for you. So it's like being more eclectic and saying, look, in this case it seems like it works, and those it doesn't, and I don't need or it's not desirable to have this method that covers every single case, or maybe it's desirable but it's not probable or something.
Yeah, I mean, but again, it's going to depend on what the exact view is. Like, so let me ask you, given what you've learned and read about it, what is your view about what conciliationism?
Oh no. Don't put me on the spot.
Like, did I gloss it pretty accurately?
I thought so. Yeah, I usually have. I'm not as up to date on the current stuff. So like I have Feldman's paper in my head deep, but that and some Kelly and stuff like that. But I haven't done a ton, except for I read some chapters in your book, which is awesome. But conciliation is like, you to some degree, I think there's like moderate and more extreme cases, and I would think like equal weight to me seems a little extreme. But I bet there's some that are like deferentists. They want to go further than 50-50, right? So it's kind of hard, but I think conciliation, if you move towards your interlocutor 1 degree, then you hold to some view of conciliationism. Does that sound right?
In specific kinds of cases, like I mean, if the view just says that there are lots of cases where you should do that, then sure, I think conciliation is right.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean, then we're in basically the dispute between these views is more like, well, which are the cases in which you have to do that?
Yeah.
And which of the cases where they look like exceptions to that kind of norm.
And how
Instead,
many cases
say
does
there's
it
more of
count?
those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many cases are there such that like, and that might be, I know in like in philosophy, I'm learning that like if you can say, well, that's just an empirical matter, then we get to like, oh yeah, that's just an empirical matter. But it's like, yeah, you have to like look at how many cases are there uh that one of them wins out. That like, oh, there's all like you're talking about the messy cases, and it seemed like there's way more messy cases than there are clean cases. So if
Yeah.
that's if that is the case, sorry to use that word so much, if that is the case, then it seems like maybe steadfasters have the upper hand because conciliationism works in a lab, works in these nice little clean cases, but those aren't the practical matters of life that we deal with every day.
So, I mean, that's one way to think about it. I think, I mean, a different route or a different approach could say, well, the messiness in itself should give you grounds for not being that confident.
Yeah. Okay.
And so then we need a story about what the messiness consists in.
Yeah.
Like, if it's like I've got a bunch of evidence, and you've told me about what your evidence is, but I can already tell that like the quality of your evidence is worse than mine.
Hmm.
Even if you have a lot of it, like is quantity and qualitative
Right.
is here. Like, you already get this in lots of epistemology where you're thinking like, look, maybe perceptual cases, sensory perception judgments are ones where there's just a quality to it. It's really hard to override it.
Yeah.
You might have a bunch of other evidence, maybe some testimonial stuff, maybe some memory stuff, maybe some other stuff, but you haven't seen the thing that we're talking about. And
Yeah.
I have.
Yeah.
Well, you might think, well, in a way, you have more evidence than I do, but mine's better or something.
Yeah.
It's qualitatively more robust, or it's just a better kind of evidence.
Yeah.
So again, like much will depend on what the messiness involves.
Yeah.
You think of it like, I think the most messy cases that might induce you to be extremely humble about whatever your leanings are ones where it's really hard to decide what counts as evidence, or there's just so many different things that could be brought in, different kinds of arguments, different kinds of experiences, or whatever, different styles of argument. There's inductive ones, and then there's explanatory or abductive ones. So, it's like, well, and if some of them cut in different directions, now we're getting very messy where you should at least not think you get to go with certain evidence and just make your view on the basis of it. You should be a little bit more careful.
Yeah.
As a way of respecting all this different evidence. If you've done that and then someone else has done that, it becomes much harder, even if you disagree at the end of the day, to think they're definitely wrong and I'm right. Because it's all you got to go on is like, well, I weighed this evidence in this way and this seems pretty probative.
Yeah.
They've approached it in a different way. Maybe they have different kinds of sort of values implicitly in play about how they're weighing evidence or what seems right to them. But again, that's gotten extremely messy on the sorts of grounds or evidence or something we're working with.
Right. Yeah, that is messy. Epistemology is so tough. I've said it before, but it's so tough.
Yeah,
it's fun talking with you about it. I do really like this. I was thinking about the defeaters and disagreement, and Sandy Goldberg's been on a few times, and I love Sandy. He's the man.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
And it was cool to see him in this book as well. He didn't mention that to me. I wish he would have. I would have asked him about it. But maybe I'll have to get him back on. So you brought up his systematic disagreement criteria, and you laid out how that can serve as like a defeater for one's justification of their beliefs.
That's how Sandy's arguing for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have that on the top of your mind? Can you lay that out for us?
Well,
three criteria?
I've got it. I've pulled it up here as one of his other papers where he talks about systematic disagreement. It says sort of different kind from what these clean cases in the epistemology of disagreement, where it's like we make a perceptual judgment about the same matter, or Christensen's check splitting cases, like we both go to dinner, we're going to split the check evenly, and we get the bill, and we each are pretty good at math. We think we just like we don't have any reason to think anyone's better than the other. We just kind of mentally calculate our share of the bill, and I come up with a different number than you. Well, the evidence we're starting with is like, there's no question about it's being the same.
Mhm.
You know, if you say that you owe $25 and I think we owe $22, it's like, well, even if one of us actually got it right, it sure seems like each of us ought to rethink and recalculate and like stop believing our answer at that time.
Right.
These cases that Sandy's more interested in are like, he calls them systematic disagreements, where he says, here's what I mean by systematic disagreement. It's widespread, it's entrenched, and it's non-localized. So I looked up to make sure I could give us the exact ways of spelling out those. So he says, a disagreement is widespread when at least two of the positions endorsed by the disagreeing parties have attracted or are capable of attracting a substantial and dedicated following. And so it's not just a disagreement between two people,
Yeah.
like between two or more groups of people, maybe large groups, right?
Mhm.
Which is to some degree committed to its claims in the face of such disagreement. So that's what it is for it to be widespread. A disagreement is non-local when it's like a disagreement not just over whether P is true, but like it's part of a much wider disagreement. It's connected to a bunch of other claims as well. So it's like P is related into these other matters such that like the groups would presumably not just disagree on this one issue, but a bunch of nearby things where they're connected and hanging together in such a way that that's part of what it is for it to be non-local.
Right.
It's not just over one local matter about some proposition, but over several that are connected in different ways.
Yeah.
And then what's the last one? Entrenched.
Yeah.
A disagreement is entrenched when he says it has persisted for at least some time, with both sides continuing to defend and advance their side in the face of persistent challenges from the other side, where the defenses in question remain responsive to the relevant evidence and arguments. And part of his project in thinking this through, this is developed in several different papers, is in one case he's applying it to religious disagreement. In other places he's applying it to philosophy overall. And he thinks if you end up believing some philosophical view, while you also realize that this systematic disagreement over that and related matters is also, so it's non-localized, but it's also widespread and entrenched. Well, that sure looks messy enough, but like intractable enough that you shouldn't think that your way through landing on one side of it is a good guide to the truth. I mean, a lot of this returns to the matter of like, are we believing for the sake of reasons that we think are getting us at the truth? Yeah. Rationality is like kind of this, broadly speaking, idea that like it's a kind of normativity that's guiding us toward theoretical or intellectual truths, and this is the process by which we're deferring to such norms and trying to use them to guide us. Well, he thinks in these kinds of cases, you shouldn't. If you're believing that you've got some if you're believing because you're justified by your appreciation of the arguments, these other features of the systematic disagreement give you a defeater for thinking. They defeat your justification for believing it.
Yeah.
One way to then deal with this is for him to say, I think this is his view, actually. Not quite remembering how he ends up solving it, but I think his view is like, we shouldn't actually believe these philosophical theories. Like we should speak or like accept them or kind of tentatively endorse them, but not believe them in the way we were starting off thinking of what belief amounts to.
Which is so tough. That's why I wanted to bring it up, because I thought of why Sandy probably didn't tell me about this, because he is a very prolific author and he's working on 1,000 things.
Yeah, I know, right?
Which is insane.
That's true.
I forgot about that, but it's crazy because it applies to like philosophy. It applies to like religions, right? Like I know people at home are thinking like, well, yeah, that sounds like a worldview or world and life view or conceptual schema or whatever. Like whatever a religion is, it applies to that. Right? Because like it's widespread, it's entrenched, it's non-localized. Like whether God exists or not, that's pretty non-localized for me. And I think like if you are taking your faith seriously, or your theism seriously, it ought to affect every one of your beliefs. Maybe there you could find a couple that don't, but if anything's entrenched and non-localized and widespread, it would be that. And so that would be like this argument for like global agnosticism on lots of things, right? Lots of really important things.
Maybe. I mean, this is to get at something we didn't touch on earlier when we were first working out our terms like belief or credence, right? I mean, you might think that's why we should call, say, religious adherence of this kind faith.
Yeah.
Here's a gloss, a pretty easy gloss someone might reach for, having just learned a little bit about this philosophy stuff and this epistemology stuff. They might say, faith is what you have when you're committed to it, maybe continuing to believe it, despite these defeaters or despite these problems. There's lots of different ways to gloss faith, even among philosophers and epistemologists.
Sure.
I actually don't have an exact view of it. I tend to think it's a fairly like cluster concept notion or a kind of pluriform notion. It's like,
sure,
in everyday language, we use it for all kinds of things related to different matters. So I don't know that there's one perfect count or definition of what, say, even religious faith amounts to.
Yeah.
But the idea that it's commitment in the face of subpar, reasons or evidence or something, and that for the religious person, that's a kind of maybe a kind of virtuous or an appropriate going for it, and nevertheless, idea that maybe someone should say that insofar as this is like what's going on with religion, that faith is the most appropriate response rather than belief or thinking or whatever. And maybe someone in that vein could say, along with Sandy, that with respect to all these areas of philosophy, we don't really use this terminology as much, but you might think my views I have defended or I think are right in philosophy really just have a kind of faith in them. But of course, a philosopher is not going to love that because they think, I got to believe on the basis of these arguments. I got to defend it. Right. So they wouldn't call it that, right? But I think in the religious perspective case, there maybe isn't something too bad if you countenance his arguments that, you have a defeater. I think here's a different way to approach Sandy's worry. If you think this is kind of the way you phrased this before, is like maybe you have a kind of error theory.
Yeah.
Or not even an error theory, but maybe you have a theory as to why there'd be this much disagreement. Maybe that's even part of your religious worldview. Like you have an explanatory set of hypotheses that we should expect there to be all this kinds of disagreement. Maybe they come from more than one source. Maybe, in a certain Christian view, you might say, well, there's sin. Or people are just considering all kinds of things, and the world's a complicated place. We shouldn't expect everyone to believe the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe also like religiosity comes to us through cultural resources. That's very diverging. It's dependent on language and traditions and different eras of history. And we should expect there to be lots of different religious worldviews. Or you could tell a theological story. You could tell a nearby cultural historical story. You could tell ones that go together. But here's the idea: is what if you have an explanation for why there's this systematic disagreement? And suppose you get tutored into your worldview or your religious perspective by realizing that's built in, like that's just part of it.
Yeah.
Now it's less clear that you could only have what I should say is it's less clear that you could justifiably believe the thing.
Yeah.
And I don't know if we should say it's because you have a defeater. It's more like the conditions under which, if you paid attention to all of this, that you're forming your belief is one where you already took into account.
Right.
Sandy is saying is the defeater, and you're nevertheless thinking it still looks good anyway. Now, of course, I think this is a very highly intellectual way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's going to typically be moved partly by practical or pragmatic considerations too, social patterns of who you get along with and who you get influenced by. I mean, these are doing work too. So you might think, to the extent that those are too operative, maybe that's going to make it so you're not as justified as you think. But the point is, it's not like there's nothing to be said for even how one could believe these things or even maybe know them.
Yeah.
In certain cases, despite widespread entrenched, non-localized, what he calls systematic disagreement.
That's awesome, man. I love that. And I know all my Calvinist friends are saying, yeah, that's what we would have said the whole time. John Calvin said the heart's an idol factory. It was already baked in. Like, of course we're going to see this disagreement. That confirms That's wild.
Well, that's good, but let me just point out that brings its own problem.
Sure.
Because if you're going to go whole hog on that side of that style of view, you're going to automatically be worried. I mean, if you're being honest, that applies to you. So you might need a way to distinguish yourself from those who are badly influenced by.
Oh yeah, for sure, man. That's
gravity and sin and all this stuff.
Yeah, it's called election.
Well, well, but a Calvinist is normally going to suppose that they're not in a good position to judge whether they're elect. That's the problem.
Yeah. There's some.
Or even if it's not supposed to be a problem, there have been many Calvinist people raised in the Reformed tradition who have begun to worry about that.
Yeah, for
because sure. It's like it's on God. It's not on you getting it right. It's like God chose you.
Yeah.
Or however exactly goes, right? So
right.
But even I think that's not just a Calvinist issue. Any religious person who's going to say, yeah, those who disagree with me it's because they're sinful or whatever.
Yeah.
Notice part of your worldview was that we're all sinful. And if that's a kind of hinge proposition or a kind of thing that was like deep down in there, and it's not merely a product of holding the worldview, right? Then you might think, I might believe these things about God and be actually fouling them up because my sin's getting in the way or whatever.
Yeah. A good Calvinist would say that happens anyways. Yeah.
Right.
That's good. I'm a Calvinist, so I can dump on them.
That's good.
They're my friends.
I can let you dump on them for me.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, so man, that's really fascinating. I'm so glad you helped us think through that one. There's a couple like just kind of random things that I want to ask about disagreement. Rich Feldman came on, and he was arguing from his chapter in your book. He was arguing that religious disagreement is not a special case of disagreement. It's just like all the others. And at first I was kind of like, I'm nervous about that. But then after I read his paper before talking with him, I thought that's good. That seems like it's a good thing, because if it were a special case, it might be subpar. Religious belief might be not up to snuff to political disagreement or moral disagreement. But if it's real, it should be. I just want to get your take on that. If you had any thoughts, do you think religious disagreement, there's something special about it, or is it similar to all the other ones? Insofar as the others are similar to each other, right? Because moral is probably way different than political, and right there's.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's useful to note that moral disagreement, political disagreement, and religious disagreement are all very messy in somewhat similarly structured ways.
Okay.
And so they have that kind of in common compared to with at least other things like disputes about empirical matters or about mathematical matters or whatever. There's a little, and so partly because it's easy to see how certain kinds of reasons or evidence should help you settle it.
Yeah.
Whereas morality and politics and religion are kind of more woolly and more complicated than that.
Yeah. I
think I agree with Rich, and also in this volume, Greta Turnbull also has a paper arguing in a different way for the same idea. Hers is her chapter is called "Religious Disagreement is Not Unique." I think they're not special or unique in the sense that like there are exceptions here where like we should say, oh, these ideas, if you think conciliationism has something right going about it, or if you think even a steadfast, that like disagreements over religion are sufficiently different such that these lessons don't apply. I think that's wrong.
Okay.
I do think it's different in another way though, which is just that kind of related to that thing about messiness. Like the messiness involved with like even deciding what's the right kind of thing that could count as evidence in this domain, or how to like dispute certain arguments someone might give, or even how to, thinking in a natural theology picture where you might think, here's some natural theology arguments for at least the existence of God. If you're going with a more revelation picture where you're like, let's just start with biblical texts, or whatever the revealed sacred texts are, you'd be like, that's the sort. But then all these questions pop up about why I think that's a revealed text that God's using, or what's its origin story, and like why should we rely on it for this matter, or what, right? It's very, very difficult to like make a good case for exactly what counts as the evidence or what's the most probative evidence in the religious domain.
Yeah.
Like, it's even harder maybe than in moral philosophy. Like in moral philosophy, we at least have this sort of starting ground of like, you mentioned the particularist and Methodist kind of thing from Chisholm, and really there's a kind of similar set of approaches in moral philosophy, which are like, look, we can make judgments about cases. That's kind of like part of our data.
Yeah.
This looks like the right thing to do in this scenario. This looks like the wrong thing to do, right?
Right.
It's like we're operating with a kind of moral faculty or something.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's been tutored by social constructions, what we learn from each other, what we praise and blame, and all this stuff. But there's a kind of coherence to the common starting ground or something.
Yeah.
So even if there's some disagreement about some matters of morality, most of us tend to think there's a lot of agreement that starts us in the same spot, even across lots of cultures, right? In religious matters, it's much more difficult to see what starts as the right kind of common starting ground or something.
Yeah.
Like it's just not, you have to start somewhere else. That's why you'd have to say, look at a sacred text or study the theological tradition, what it's saying about us and about God or whatever. And then think to yourself, kind of, does that sound right? Or
Yeah.
or living this, does this help me flourish? Does this challenge me and help me flourish? Does it make me a better person? All the relevant sort of tests you might use, but different people will even have different reasons for thinking those are right. And so that's why it's different in one way.
Yeah.
It's a little more like politics, maybe political notions. Like,
yeah,
there are values in place somewhere. There's evidence and arguments, but then how does this thing get off the ground? It's like we're already off the ground, but we don't know how we got there, and then how to make the case for continuing to fly off the ground or whatever that metaphor is supposed to be.
Yeah. We can't agree if it should have 2 wings or 4 wings or a
Right.
Yeah, a propeller. That's interesting because I think about like religious experience, and I'm my dad was saved in a charismatic Christian commune in the 70s after he hitchhiked, so like way
Yeah.
out there stuff, and then he immediately went from there to like a staunch hardcore Baptist church that didn't believe in the gifts, or they were cessationists. So my pops has like 2 different Christians in his head, where he
Right.
today God told me, and the next day like God speaks from the word alone, and so that's how I was raised. So I got a little bit of all that in my head. But some people will say, look, God speaks through His word today. That's it, and I can show you from Hebrews or wherever, like it's done. And other people are like, no, dude, God told me to give this guy $500. He gave me an impression or a feeling. I didn't hear a voice, so don't lock me up. But and then it turned out that guy prayed for $500 to turn his phone back on in the morning, like. And so there, even within Christian traditions and within certain denominations themselves, there's disagreement about what counts as evidence in religious disagreements, which is wild. Yeah.
Right. And that's among people who largely, in one way, agree. Right.
Right. Yeah. They go to church
Christians.
together.
I think it's really useful to see, like, insofar as there's any takeaways from even just a podcast on this for today or whatever, like, when we're worried about things about disagreement, things get more complicated even in religion straight off the bat, different than the clean cases we were starting with.
Sure.
You can start to identify ground where there's a lot of in like agreement versus disagreement. So like, here's something in the early chapter of this book I talk about, and I feel like not many people have really labeled it this way, that I think is useful. We can talk about different kinds of religious disagreement, where we can first talk about, like, we often are talking about inter-religious disagreement, like between people in different religions.
Yep.
Right? Like between Muslims and Jews, or Christians and Buddhists, or Christians and Muslims, or what. You can talk about interreligious disagreement, but you can also talk about, among the monotheist traditions, interreligious agreement. Like, Christians and Muslims and Jews all think there's one God that is rough, at least maybe not, depending on how you're going to gloss omnipotence and omniscience and, being loving, or there's going to be slight differences, but they tend to agree there's one divine being that created everything there is, and who has some of these divine attributes.
Yeah.
And then it falls apart when you start talking about more specific things like, well, what's that God doing in the world? And how is God revealing God's self through various traditions? Or is Jesus crucial for atonement or, redemption or what? Was Jesus divine? Like all, now we're talking about their disagreements.
Yeah.
But it's important to see there's a massive amount of kind of core agreement, interreligious agreement.
Yeah.
But then we can also talk about, of course, the thing you were just talking about, intra-religious disagreement, like between practitioners of, say, Christianity or believers of Christianity. There's all these different denominations and disputes about more specific things, right?
Right.
That's intra-religious disagreement. But there's also intra-religious agreement of a very crucial sort between all Christians, you might think or hope for anyway.
Right.
And then there's also what you might call extra-religious disagreement, for example, between those who are religious and those who are not, or like agnostics or naturalists or something.
Yeah.
And then like all the rest. Notice you need to help yourself to a kind of way of demarcating what counts as a religion here.
Yeah.
It's a hard thing to do.
Sure.
I mean, any religious studies scholar will tell you that's ridiculously hard.
Yep.
It's of a piece with like the demarcation problem in philosophy of science.
Yep.
But just to suppose there's a way to do that works fine. Well, a lot of the issues in our book tend to be postured in terms of, well, there's a bunch of smart atheists out there, and if you're a theist or religious in some way, we have these different beliefs. And they're talking a lot about extra-religious disagreement.
Right.
But to return to then, there's going to be also a lot of extra-religious agreement on other matters.
Yeah.
Not exactly over religiosity stuff, but. And so one thing that's fascinating is related to, I think, did John come on your thing for common consent argument?
Matheson, yeah.
So common consent argument is trading on interreligious agreement.
Yeah.
Right, like all these Christians and Muslims and Jews, and historically so, all think there's a divine being of this kind.
Yeah.
And that's a huge number of people.
Right.
That's locating a kind of pressure that might stem from interreligious agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So the atheist or agnostic might think, when they start looking at that one, they might be like, oh, geez, that feels like it could be a kind of pressure from a kind of extra religious disagreement with me, if you're an atheist, let's say. But there's widespread agreement against me on that matter. See what I mean?
Right.
I think those labels are useful to see where there's both, where there are problems, where there are not problems.
I really like that. Yeah, they're helpful in charting the logical space. I know some people hate that, but some people love that.
Sure, no, right.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it is fascinating because I don't know how, I'll let the atheists do it, but how they would weigh the intra agreement versus the inter agreement and inter disagreement. So yeah, they all agree, and we can go with Matheson's common consent, and that seems like it's maybe kind of scary. But then if you take a closer look, some of them are neoclassical theists, and they are raging against the classical theists who are not quite. They're having Christian ones are going to be different than Muslim ones, than Jewish ones, and so then how do you weigh that? Like, yeah, they all agree on one proposition, and maybe John Hicks steps in and says, but it's all the religious ultimate. But yeah, it's fun. It's really fun to think through that, and it's serious too, right? Like all my Christian friends are like, it's not just fun. This it's eternal weight of glory is on the line. Yeah, okay, it's true.
But look, I mean, I think somewhere in a footnote in that opening chapter, I point this out. Like, if you had a case, just make it abstract. Like, suppose there's 9 people that you encounter that all agree on P. They all believe that P. But they also have all these disputes about Q, R, S, T, U, V, like all these like other things.
Yeah.
In the non-local sense of like Sandy's thing is like, those are related to each other for them about why they're disputing over Q, R, S, T claims. But they all agree on P.
Yeah.
But I find myself not believing that P.
Mm-hmm.
Be awkward. I think I shouldn't be much moved by their internal disagreements over QRSTU, all that. When I'm worried about the question about whether I've got P right.
Yeah. Well, so what
it's a bit like, shall we go to dinner at this restaurant? I think we shouldn't go at all. We shouldn't eat at all. We should fast right now or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm sure you go to the restaurant and you're arguing over what to order. Like, be like, well, there's room for like deciding what you should order.
Yeah.
That's different from whether you should go to the restaurant at all. Like that's a
Well,
separate, different.
yeah, I
It
love that.
presupposes those other things.
I think that's right, but I can imagine. I have a particular friend of mine who might say, no, the case is more like they agree. They superficially agree on P, but other QRST, all that kind of affects P, and so really, it's one has P star, one has P star star, one has P star star star, and so it's that they're not all actually agreeing on P. What do you make of that? It'd be like, yeah, they
Yeah,
think
I think it depends on how. I mean, you'd have to ask the many people, like, are they really different claims? Because notice they're not arguing with each other over the P thing. Like,
yeah.
I mean, I started with the idea that, like, there's one God. Well, okay, there is a dispute between Muslims and Christians.
A Muslim's going to say,
Muslims
you guys
will say, you think there's three gods.
Right.
I mean, there's that, right? But there's a way in which, of course, you probably have to defer to someone's religious tradition about what they say the views are.
You're saying that there is one God. Yeah.
And so,
that's good.
So they might, they might think, no, I don't understand your view. And that sounds to me like three gods. They might have a problem with that.
Yeah.
But I think, insofar as someone from outside will insist, oh, no, these are too different from one another, so they don't even have this agreement. I think you'd have to check what the theologians and the believers of those things would say.
That's good.
I mean, between Judaism and Christianity, there's at least, I think, this much going for it. Like, Christians ought to say that Jews are worshiping the God that I think we should say is the God of Jesus, and it's the God of Abraham, and it's the same as the God of Jesus.
And we know his name. We would call him Yahweh. They wouldn't call him Yahweh. Sorry, Jewish listeners.
Totally, but
offensive.
But like, I mean, the very sort of transmission and the drawing on different, some similar sacred texts and the history of it is supposed to be in itself a way of like pointing out, well, there's a lot of agreement here.
Yeah.
Definitely a lot of disagreement. Yeah. But the core idea underneath it all is not one that's being disputed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yahweh is the God that revealed himself to the Hebrew people and made covenant with them, all of that.
Yeah.
And then the Christian says some special things later. But the Christian and the Jew should be able to have this much common ground where they're like, yeah, like there's a whole lot that we agree on.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know where your friend that might have said that was coming from. Maybe they have a more nuanced way of parsing why it is that these are actually different claims.
Do you know Joe Schmidt at all? Do you know that name from the circles that we run in? He's an undergrad at Purdue, but he's like stupid smart.
Joe Schmidt. Okay.
And he is very nuanced. But oftentimes he'll quibble with people who make the argument for God from so many arguments, right? So there's the argument from so many arguments. Look at all these. You got planning a project where there's all these put together, right? And he'll say, well, look, a lot of these are arguments for rival conceptions of God. Some of these are for the God of classical theism, but others are for this neoclassical theistic God where, God is not simple. And so they don't all get to add up in the way that the proponent of the argument from all arguments.
I see. No, that seems right insofar as there will be certain arguments for certain beings that depend on a specific gloss on what that being's attributes will be.
Yeah.
And so, but then what we're moving into is different terrain. I mean, insofar as we're talking about whether God is simple and what it means, simplicity, well, then we're actually talking about, the way I'm putting it is, this is an intra-religious, or maybe you can think of it as intra-theistic disagreement.
Yeah.
It's about how to think about God's attributes.
And it's QRST, it's all the other ones, but
it's the specific thing, but we're saying there's a being.
Yeah,
I mean, this goes with other stuff. Like, you and I can know someone in common, but have different takes on what they're like. Or like, you might believe certain false things about them, and I might believe some other false things. We believe some true things about them. But there's a person we both, I mean, unless we're both hallucinating.
Yeah,
like,
right.
Person we're both relating to and know personally or whatever it is. And like, there's presumably behind it some fact of the matter about some of the attributes we would give or place, say that person is like.
Yeah.
It's not a stretch. I mean, it's not special about God to be like, oh, there's things coming apart. No, it's really like all these theists think there's a divine being like that.
Okay.
And have a kind of broadly similar understanding of what divine would have to be like, a kind of minimal notion.
Yeah.
Then once you get beyond the minimal, of course, now there's lots of intra terrain to discover.
So, and I use this phrase a lot, and I might not understand it. And I should probably not use it until I do. But it's like God's like it's a rigid designator picking out this entity God, and not like a definite description. Because if it were a definite description, then you change one little aspect, and it's a whole different thing.
Totally.
That sound right?
I mean, that seems right. I mean,
Very cool.
I think there's some room, of course, for work on the nature of reference.
Sure.
From Kripke and others in that kind of picture to be like, I mean, there's actually good work on this by people like Megan Sullivan, where they're, you know, she's like, she has a cool paper. I mean, maybe you want to find it, maybe you don't, but she has an earlier paper. She was a grad student, colleague of mine. She teaches at Notre Dame now.
Yeah.
There's an early paper called Semantics for Blasphemy, where she's like, look, how do we talk about these attributes that like where there's this dispute over them? And how do we talk about whether certain names or even descriptions let us refer to God, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like what you're getting at. Like if the causal story is a roughly Kripkean one on which, well, we kind of inherited a name and we can defer our intentions to the individuals along the chain of transmission. And it's a good causal chain, not a disrupted one.
Yeah.
Then just like with other people's names and so on, by testimonial means, we can learn people's names and successfully refer to them. Same thing with God.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'd be like a rigid, if the name functions, if God is a name, you know, and not merely a definite description or some kind of title that functions as a name, then sure, why couldn't it rigidly designate and refer to the same being, even though different people will have different characteristics or definite descriptions in play mentally for themselves. They think they're referring to a being that's got these attributes. Well, some people will be wrong about some of those, but that doesn't change whether they can refer to that being.
That's good, and I should look up that paper because you're like the fourth or fifth person who's told me about it, I think.
There's another good paper by her in the Hidden Divinity and Religious Belief volume by Adam Green and edited by Adam Green and Eleanor Stump.
Okay.
Another paper that I teach on it, where she's deploying more of this too about reference.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because this is kind of it gets into a practical matter for Christians where Christians today say, "Oh my God," and people are like, "You should say gosh," and it's like, yeah, but is gosh picking out the same thing? And it's not we're not saying Yahweh, but is the intention behind there to still refer to the same being God? Or is there any intention, or you just, you know? So I love that kind of stuff, and I love being
right.
Some people would say pedantic, but it's important. I think it's cool to think through that stuff.
Yeah.
Matt, can I ask you just a couple pop philosophy questions before I let you go here?
Sure.
All right, awesome. So I've been kind of giving some of my philosopher friends a hard time because there's a popular phrase today that is, I want a public-facing philosophy. And, you know, no shame to anyone who's used it, but I like to give them a little bit of hard time because they want their hard work, which is really great, to be popularized, but they don't want this popular-facing philosophy in that they don't want to see what the popular philosophers are asking or what popular thinkers are questioning over, you know, like NFTs and the metaverse and these kind of things, right? They don't want to touch that stupid stuff. Let me just talk about. So I'm going to start asking, you know, my philosopher friends, because I am trying to popularize your work, but I want to ask what the people are asking as well. So when it comes to like, let me think. When it comes to like brain in a vat cases, I'm trying to like problematize this. If my peers think that we ought to be infallibilists instead of fallibilists, and they think, you know, maybe we just simply can't know that we're
brains, whether we're brains and vats, is that
right? Should that move me at all? In that case, should I be? They're my peers, man. They don't know. They think maybe. And they think maybe.
I need you to back up the wait.
Yeah.
What's the infallible? What do you mean by the infallibilist versus fallibilist?
Yeah, I thought that like fallibilism gets you out of this, where it's like, you look, I can fallibly know that I'm not a brain in a vat, right? Like, yeah, I could be wrong. I could be a brain in a vat. So I can't like infallibly know that I'm not a brain in a vat, but I can fallibly know that I am not one.
This is very complicated for a last minute question.
Sorry. Yeah, we don't have to if you don't want.
I mean, and I'm on record for liking a certain infallibilist picture about knowledge.
Ooh, okay.
Because I I have these other sympathies and also have argued for it on different grounds. So let me just put it like this. I don't think the right way to think about infallibilism about knowledge is to mean that it tracks with how willing you are to entertain the possibility that you're wrong.
Okay.
So there's a different way to, I mean, that's the kind of standard way to be like, if I doubt it, or I think I make the judgment that I might be wrong about this, then that shows me that I couldn't know it, at least in the infallibilist sense.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the way to come at it.
Okay.
Once you change that way of thinking about it, there opens up room for being an infallibilist in the sense that if you do know, it's not epistemically possible for you that you're wrong,
Okay.
but you might make the wrong judgment about it being epistemically possible because you're doing imaginative stuff. You're like,
Yeah.
well, I can't rule out that I'm dreaming, or I can't rule out that I'm a brain in a vat. You're doing this sort of move with the machinery of certain views in epistemology. But I don't think doing that is needed in order to know.
Okay.
I mean, part of this is exposing I'm more of an externalist than an internalist.
Yeah.
Some of this. So,
Sure.
but let me go to the brain in a vat case. I mean, I tend to think, along with, in a way, what J.L. Austin sometimes says about the dreaming case, and some others after him, that like you, basically, if you're not dreaming or if you're not a brain in a vat, you can know that. That doesn't mean you have any amazing grounds for distinguishing each.
Yeah.
So it just means, I mean, maybe you do have that, but you feel like you can't. A lot of that's going to depend on how vividly you dream and things like that. So that's
yeah.
a local matter depending on each person. But I think we shouldn't say. I'm less inclined to do what lots of internalists will do, which is like, if they're indistinguishable, then that tells us what we're justified in believing, or that tells us something about whether we could know. I don't think that's the right way to come at it. In a way, it's like, when you know that you're not a brain in a vat, it's because you're in the good case that you're not a brain in a vat.
Yeah.
Right?
That's so tough, man, because like, well,
and so here, let me just finish that thought.
Please finish.
So we are, I'll just go ahead and say it. We are not brains in vats, right?
Maybe.
None of it turns on the fact that we are not that. The grounds we have are sufficient for knowing in those cases, even though, of course, if it were a nearby possibility, and so modally speaking, if it's a nearby possibility that we could be invatted right now because there was a guy who was about to invat us or something the other day.
Yeah, right.
Or whatever. Now we wouldn't know, even though it's true.
Yeah.
But I think the point is, like, you can't just start with, this is my take on, you can't just start with the way it seems from within your head and have that be the whole story about what you're justified in believing or whether you could know. It also depends quite a bit on the external situation.
Yeah. So, but
so distinguishability from within one's, sort of from the skin in or something, or from your phenomenal field or something, is not the mark for me.
Sure.
Whether you're justified or whether you're believing. And so I think you can know that you're not, in lots of cases, not always, right? You can know that you're not dreaming. You can know that you're not a brain in a vat when you have good enough grounds and let's say it's safe or whatever, modally safe, and then it's true.
So how do we know if it's modally safe or not? Because
you don't need to know that it's modally safe. That's the key. So
we are in the good case.
Being in the good case plus it being, sort of sufficiently enough in the good case, that's the modal. Like, it's not a nearby possibility for us that I not be in that good case.
Why is it not a nearby possibility?
Well, I'm just helping myself to the assumption that there's not someone going around invading people.
Okay. If there was, though, would that mess things up?
It could.
Like a Dr. Kevorkian-esque person who's going around stealing people's brains?
It could. Then it would depend a little bit more on how close that guy has gotten to me in the actual physical world here.
Okay. Well, so in a very similar case, some people say it's the same thing, but simulation hypothesis, where we're not brains and vats, but we're digitally conscious beings, like simulated, things.
Yeah.
As we get closer to making, the metaverse or, whatever, whoever wins out, does that mess with the modality there? Like, does that mess with our moral concerns that, like, okay, so in 15 years from now, Zuckerberg's got a super realistic simulation, metaverse, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make it more possible or more plausible that we're not in the good case?
Um, is it the kind of scenario where we can enter the metaverse and exit, and then after a while we do it a bunch of times and we can't tell the difference?
Yeah, that's a good.
Look
I should have.
like
It's either that. So there's two. One is that like, yeah, you entered in and you forgot that you ever did, or I guess you'd have to say something else like you took a pill that made you forget. Or like Vanilla Sky with Tom Cruise or something. If you've seen that movie,
a long time ago.
he's in the dream, right? But he willfully entered into it, waiting out his time. He's like in a cryo chamber, but he
Right.
was having a lucid dream.
I mean,
Or
yeah.
the other one is that you are a digitally conscious being, right? That you just are. There's nothing over and above your
Well, right.
digital
So
self.
if I'm already a digitally conscious being, or we're
Mhm.
already brains and vats, then my view of the case is that we can't know that we're not, because that's false.
Right.
So that's why the facts do some work. Right? It's just that you can't move from that straight over to the idea that, like, well, it sure looks like it would look the same from within.
Yeah.
We're a brain in a vat, or if I were in the metaverse, or if I were, in
The
a,
facts matter. Yeah. The case actually
the
matters.
facts do work, including how modally close they are. Now that's why it makes it a little harder if we're like, look, if there develops very right now, we are all in the real world, but there's going to be very soon a version where we can enter a simulation and we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Well, if it's, I mean, I guess my answer would probably turn on like how close I came to deciding to enter it in the first place. Like
Well,
that's going to be related to how modally.
yeah. Well,
Well,
you could think
is.
of someone who Zuckerberg comes around knocking people out and putting them in there and erasing the fact that they got knocked out and put in there, right? So like there's a body snatcher, Zuck, who steals people and puts them in there. If you had that knowledge, that would make things more mortally close for you, right? Because you're like, I wouldn't remember even if.
Well, it doesn't matter whether I know about it. What matters is how.
Okay.
I mean,
Because
this is the point.
you're
Like,
not an internalist, yeah, right,
yeah, no.
right,
And in
right,
fact,
right.
I'm such not an internalist that I will say the brain of that and I have different evidence. The dreaming version, or the sort of person in the simulation and I have just different evidence. So
Okay.
that's wild for most internalists. But I think that's a way to make good on the, like, we don't, again, the point though is like you have to allow, we don't have great access exactly to the nature of our evidence.
Okay.
That's for internalists don't like any of these moves.
I know they're all freaking out at home.
They want a good grip on what their evidence is. They want to have pretty good access, perfect access to it. They want to have the norms by which we're using that evidence to be operationalizable, where you know that you're following the rules or whatever. I'm just not. I'm not in that universe. But like so someone that might be like, that's a stupid view or set of views. But one of the payoffs is I get to say, and it's not like this is driving it, of course, but one of the
Right.
payoffs is that like I get to say, I can know I'm not a brain in a vat without having some amazingly, you know, dismissive evidence that would help me discern that I'm not a brain in a vat. It's just I've got, even on the Williamson E equals K view, it's like I've got as part of my evidence that I'm not a brain in a vat.
Yeah.
And so do you, I would say. So, but it's like, even in that case where I got it as part of my evidence, here's what's tricky. If it becomes modally safe or unsafe, like there's a nearby possibility, even in the physical world, that I go invatted. Now it's trickier to solve given the model, but I think we should say if it's a nearby possibility that I would have been invited or I would have been in a simulation, even though I'm not, that doesn't throw off the truth, but it does throw off how possible or how nearby it was
Yeah.
that I couldn't now or soon be. So then I have to say it's less clear to me that I could know if that's what's going on. And that's the possibility of the metaverse looming makes it a little less. I mean, it doesn't change what I know it now.
Right.
But later, or if it's like a Black Mirror thing where people coming and going and enjoying a different set life.
Yeah.
If they were making judgments about, oh, this is the real world and this is the virtual world, those judgments are going to be not very stable or not very safe.
Well, so what we just discovered is that we need to have externalists rally against Zuckerberg and say, "Look, you're making things very modally unsafe for us. You need to stop." You know, this is not good. So just real quick, last follow up here.
Yeah.
Do you think that you have different evidence than the brain in a vat or the simulated sim because of like content externalism, that you've interacted with real things and they've interacted with digital or simulated things? Is that what makes the evidence different?
That's part of it.
Okay.
Or at least that's available to say.
Okay.
I mean, it's not in a way that if I go that route only, then it throws off, I think, some of the other things I would want to say.
Okay.
Rather just say, insofar as the brain in a vat sort of twin or whatever,
Yeah.
would have what looks like similar contents in its belief to what mine have, I have to say the content just is different, because mine are about the actual physical world and its are not.
Yeah.
So the content externalism will do that, but I think you also just can run it without needing too much of that.
Okay.
I've got a lot of knowledge of various kinds that it doesn't have.
Yeah.
And because I like E equals K, we just have very different evidence.
Yeah.
Then it's unsurprising that I could know and it couldn't, or that I could be justified in believing or something like that and it couldn't, because we just have very different evidence.
If your simulated twin, so that he's not a brain in a vat, simulated twin, whether that occasions the case or not, simulated Matt thinks that he's on a podcast with Parker. He has evidence for that.
Where Parker's a real person?
No, simulated Parker as well. In the simulated world, he doesn't think it's simulated Parker. He thinks just what you think right now. Presumably, you're not thinking this is not a simulated Parker. This is a real Parker, right? That's not like part of what's going on in your head. Probably, maybe it is now because I brought that up. but right, so like he has the same beliefs as you, but your evidence is knowledge. Is his evidence knowledge, but like simulated knowledge? Now knowledge star.
I mean, so wait, make sure I'm understanding the case right. So the twin of mine that's in a simulation believes of himself that he's not in a simulation, and believes that he's on a podcast with someone, Parker, who's not in the simulation, all that?
Probably not the simulation part. He probably just thinks that he's talking to Parker on a podcast. Right? Because that usually we don't go around thinking like.
Well, in the simulation, that's true. So
okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. Whether he can have true beliefs in the simulation.
Oh yeah, I mean, notice the content externalist. It will make it the case we just have different contents, but then that brain in a vat of the simulated version has lots of true beliefs.
Okay.
And maybe a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay. But then it gets thrown off because we thought these were supposed to be on a par or something. But then if we change that content, now they're believing different stuff about different.
Gotcha.
Or something.
That's helpful. Okay. That's really good, man. This is fun. See, this is good. This is like I'm gonna clip this.
This is a lot of fun.
This is gonna be really good. Okay. Real quick. As we go, man. I don't know if it's because I've seen Johnny Depp in the public lot, but you got like this young Johnny Depp vibe going. Has anyone ever told you? No one's ever told you that?
I really do. I don't think I do.
Right there, man. I'm the audience. If you guys see it, comment and let me know that I'm right, because I'm seeing it right now. It's pretty awesome, man. But Matt, thanks so much for all your time here, man. Thanks for the book and getting your publisher to send it my way.
Sure. Really I hope they send you a hard copy at some point.
Yeah, that'd be really nice. Because I don't know if I'll ever be able to afford it when they come out with the soft cover for sure. But I appreciate your time and sending me the work. I'm looking forward to reaching out to some more of the folks from the volume, because it's really cool. It's really important, really fun stuff, and helping me think about my faith even more seriously.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. You mentioned some of your other work. Do you have that somewhere where the audience can go find more of your stuff?
I mean, sure. I have a website. You can Google me and find me.
Okay.
It's an spu.edu housed site.
Sure.
Almost all of my stuff is also often my own versions. Like even the Disagreement in Religion chapter that starts this volume off as its kind of introductory thing, I have my own sort of PDF versions you can find on Phil Papers as well.
Okay, cool.
I have a Phil Papers, or they call it Phil People profile. It shows all that. So if someone wants to go look at that or download it and read my chapter without getting the book, that's easy to do.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah.
And I
Well,
can send it to you. I don't know if you
I'll
put that in the show notes
Yep.
or in the description, but like that
Absolutely.
would be an easy way for people to check some more stuff out. If they want.
Okay. Awesome. Well, man, this has been fantastic. That's going to have to do it for now, folks. This has been Parker's Pensées. And as always, all glory to God.